some of the characteristics of the poem and some information regarding the author. The poem itself. Who is the author of Tuhfatul Atfal? He is the famous Imam, the Sheikh, the Qari, Sulaiman ibn Hussein al-Jamzuri. Sulaiman ibn Hussein al-Jamzuri. He was born in 100 or 1160 Hijri, and he died sometime after 1213 Hijri. We're not sure when, but it was sometime after 1213 Hijri. So he's from the ulama of the 18th Common Era, 18th century Common Era. Sheikh Sulaiman al-Jamzuri was born and raised in Tanta, Egypt. This is a very well-known area in Egypt, even nowadays. And he was born in the district that is known as Al-Janzur. But he also has other works as well. His teacher is the famous Sheikh Nuruddin Ali al-Mihi, who was also from the ulama of the 18th century Common Era. And if you have any ijaza or sanad from an Egyptian sheikh, most likely you will find in that sanad Nuruddin Ali al-Mihi somewhere in that chain. So Sheikh Sulaiman al-Jamzuri, he's the student of this famous Sheikh Nuruddin Ali al-Mihi. So let's look at what the poem itself contains. How is it broken up? What are the contents of this poem by the Sheikh? And if you guys go back in the WhatsApp group, we have posted, inshallah, the version of the poem that we're going to be relying on. This is Tuhfatul Atfal with the tahqiq of Muhammad Taym Za'bi, hafidhahullah. This is the one that we're going to be referring to, and you may find different versions of the poem with different dabt and tahqiq, but that's the one we'll rely on for this class. Today, inshallah, we're going to try and cover up until verse 23 of the poem, from verse 1 to verse 23 of the poem, inshallah. So the first set is from verses from verses 1 to 5 is the muqaddimah of the poem. He's not talking about rules, he's just introducing the content of the poem. And then from verses 6 to 16, this is where the actual rules of tajweed start being discussed. And the first thing that Sheikh Sulaiman al-Jamzuri starts off his poem with is talking about ahkam an-noon as-sakina wa tanween, the rules for noon, sakina, and tanween. And the reason why is because this is the most common and the most repeated type of tajweed rule you find in the Quran over and over again. Any page of the Quran you open up, you're going to find the whole page filled with ahkam of noon and tanween. After that, he has one verse where he puts a bab and he says hukm al-noon wal-mim al-mushaddadatain, the rule for noon and mim with shadda. And this is just one verse, verse 17. And then verses 18 to 23, he talks about ahkam al-mim as-sakina, the rules for mim with sukoon. Then after he finishes the ahkam of noon and mim, he moves on to ahkam al-lam as-sakina, verses 24 to 29, the rules for lam with sukoon on it. And then he talks about the rules of idgham al-harfayn al-mutamathilayn wal-mutaqaribayn wal-mutajanisayn, yani doing merging of letters that are similar or identical or close to each other, and that's verses 30 to 34. And then the final and perhaps biggest section of the poem is from verses 35 to 57, where he talks about ahkam al-mad. So today, inshallah, we're going to cover topic number 1, 2, and 3 from verses 6 or from verses 1 all the way to verse 23, which is covers ahkam al-noon, as-sakina wa tanween, all the way up to ahkam al-mim, as-sakina, inshallah. And the way I recommend you participate in this class is that you have the poem with you, either an electronic version or a printed out version, and you have a pen and paper as well, because as we go along with the poem, we're just going to annotate and mention some points about the text, and then we're going to explain in a bit more detail afterwards. طيب, so نبدأ. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Here we will recite the first 5 verses of the poem. قال الشيخ رحمه الله تعالى بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يقول راجي رحمة الغفور دوما سليمان هو الجمزور. So the Shaykh starts off his poem by saying يقول, يعني he is saying راجي رحمة الغفور, the one who desires the mercy of the most merciful. Who is this person who is saying this all the time? دوما, he is saying this. He is Sulaiman هو الجمزوري. Sulaiman al-Jamzuri. Verse number 2. الحمد لله مصليا على محمد وآله ومن تلا. And then the Shaykh starts off his poem, as is always recommended to do, by praising Allah Azza wa Jal. Alhamdulillah. Musalliyan ala Muhammad, giving salah to Prophet Muhammad, wa alihi, and his family members, wa man tala, and those who come after, or those who follow them. And then verse number 3, wa ba'du, and after these 2 verses of introduction, هذا النظم للمريد في النون والتنوين والمدود. He says this nazm, this poem, is for the one who wants, يعني the one who desires, the one who wants to know about في النون والتنوين والمدود, يعني rules related to noon and rules related to tanween and rules related to mad. And he also, as we just talked about, covers other topics as well in this poem. Then verse number 4, the Shaykh says, سميته بتحفة الأطفال عن شيخنا الميهي ذي الكمال. He says, I have named this poem that I have written تحفة الأطفال. And the word tuhfa in Arabic means when you take part of something, like the best part of something, and you give it as a gift. You specialize part of something and you give it as a gift. So it's like he's saying this is a small gift to the children. And when he says children, if you go back to his sharh, we'll talk about that later. He goes back to his sharh, he says he does not mean actual children, but he means anyone who is a beginner in tajweed, or yani anyone who wants to start learning about tajweed. This is a gift for them, للأطفال. And he says he received this knowledge of tajweed from Shaykhina, from his Shaykh al-Mihi. We said this is Ali al-Mihi, Dhil Kamali, and he praises him here by saying Dhil Kamali. And then verse 5, he says, أرجو به أن ينفع الطلاب. I hope, he says, أرجو به أن ينفع الطلاب. I hope the students of tajweed and Quran will benefit from this text. And he also hopes for وَالْأَجْرَ وَالْقَبُولَ وَالثَّوَابَ. He also hopes for reward and for acceptance and for blessings from writing this poem and from people reading it and utilizing this poem. And we ask Allah Azza wa Jalla to give him that reward for the numerous people that have benefited from this text. طيب, now that we see what he just discussed in the introduction, just a couple of notes. The Shaykh does not cover makharij al-huruf in this text. Makharij al-huruf, yani where the letter comes from, points of articulation for the letters. Yani which part of the tongue and mouth and lips are used to create the letters. He does not talk about this in the poem. And he also doesn't talk about sifat al-huruf, the characteristics of letters, what makes letters different from each other. And he also does not talk about any aspect of al-rasm al-uthmani, which is how the words are written in the mushaf. And the reason why is because this is meant, as we said before, as a text for beginners, someone who is just embarking into the science of tajweed. And so he doesn't consider it that important to include this information. And this is in contrast to another very famous poem, which is Al-Muqaddima al-Jazariya, because Ibn al-Jazari puts these topics first. Ibn al-Jazari, before he talks about tanween and mad and noon, he talks about makharij al-huruf and sifat al-huruf, because he says قبل الشروع أولا أن يعلموا مخارج الحروف والصفات ليلفظوا. Because Ibn al-Jazari says before you even enter or recite Quran or enter into the science of tajweed, you have to know where the letters come from and where the sifat or what the sifat of the huruf are. But it's not a huge issue because a person can still recite Quran correctly without knowing the specifics of the makharij or the sifat. And that's why the Shaykh Sulaiman al-Jamzuri opted not to include them in this poem. طيب, so now we get to the first chapter of the poem, the first bab of the poem. And the Shaykh says, أحكام النون الساكنة والتنوين. The rules, and notice that it's plural for noon as-sakina, noon with sukoon and tanween. And we'll talk about why we group them together, why we treat them as the same thing. So verse number 6 of the poem, قال الشيخ للنون إن تسكن وللتنوين أربع أحكام فخذ تبييني. The Shaykh says للنون إن تسكن. When the noon has sukoon, and this is an important point to remember, we only care right now about noon with sukoon. We don't care about noon with fatha, noon with kasra, dhamma. We only care about noon with sukoon, and its cousin or its sister is tanween, because they both create the same sound. If I have alif with fatha and then noon after it with sukoon, I'm going to say an. And if I have tanween fatha, the same sound it's going to make an. They both produce the same sound. They're both noon, right? So that's how we keep them together. The Shaykh says, if you have noon with sukoon or with tanween anywhere in the Quran, they always have arba'u ahkamin. They always have 4 ahkam, right? That means that every single noon with sukoon you see in the Quran and every single tanween that appears in the Quran has to fall into one of 4 rules. It cannot not fall into one of these rules, and it cannot simultaneously exist in 2 at once. It has to be in one of 4 rules that we'll discuss. And he says, فَخُذْ تَبْيِينِي. Take my clarification. I'm going to clarify what these rules are for you. So the Shaykh, as he says, لِلنُّونِ تَسْكُنْ وَالتَّنْوِينِ أَرْبَعُ أَحْكَامٍ. There are 4 rules of noon sakina and tanween. So first, let's discuss what is noon sakina. What is noon with a sukoon on it? Noon sakina means I have the letter noon and there is no vowel sound on top of it. There is no fatha, there is no dhamma, there is no kasra. It's just sukoon on top of the noon, right? And we find the noon in nouns, in verbs, in particles, in nouns, verbs, and particles, يعني في الأسماء والأفعال والحروف. And we say that the noon as a letter exists in pronunciation, lafzan, and in writing, khattan. When I write a word in Arabic with noon, I have to actually draw the noon there. When I'm continuing or when I'm stopping on the word, the noon will always be there. And the noon can appear in the middle of a word, mutawassita, or at the end of a word, mutatarrifa. And it can be an original part of the word, asliya, or it can be an extra letter in the case of verbs, where we say it's noon za'ida. So here are 2 examples. In the word man aman, right? Man aman, I have noon and sukoon on top of it. And this is how they draw sukoon in the mushaf. And also min had, right? It's written as part of the word and has sukoon on top of it. Now let's look at what tanween is. Tanween is an extra noon, right? It's an extra noon that is placed after the last letter of Arabic nouns. That's the important part, right? Tanween only exists on the end of Arabic nouns, nowhere else for our purposes, right? And the tanween only exists in pronunciation. I only pronounce it as a noon. I don't actually write a noon on the letter. So if I say kitabun, I don't put kaf. ta, alif, ba, noon. La. I just pronounce it as a noon. I say kitabun. So we say it only exists in pronunciation, lafzan, not in writing. La khattan, not in writing. And also, I only pronounce the tanween, the extra noon, when I'm continuing on to the next word. If I stop, I don't pronounce the tanween. So if I say, هذا كتاب جميل, أو هذا كتاب جميل, because I'm continuing, I say kitabun jamil. But if I stopped on the word kitab, I would just say هذا kitab. There's no noon there. There's no tanween there, right? So the tanween only exists when continuing, not when stopping. And also with regards to tanween fatha on the end of a word, if I stop on tanween fatha, I have to convert that tanween into an alif. So if I have the word sama'an, if I stop on the word, I don't say sama'an, I say sama'a, right? Was-sama'a bina'a, not bina'an, bina'a. Except if the tanween is on top of ta marbuta, right? So if I say, for example, a word that has ta marbuta and fatha, tanween fatha on the end, when I stop, I'm just going to say I'm not going to say for that word. And the same applies for the other harakat as well, whether they're on ta marbut or any other letter, tanween dhamma and tanween fatha. If I stop on the word, I do not pronounce the tanween. Here's examples in the Quran. We have the word alimun hakim, adhaban alima. See, I say alima, not aliman, because if I stop on tanween fatha, it turns into alif. We say this is mad iwad. I change it into alif. Kaffarin athim, right? And the way I represent tanween is by doubling the haraka. So if it's tanween dhamma, put 2 dhammas. Tanween fatha, 2 fatha. Tanween kasra, 2 kasra, right? I do not draw the tanween as an actual noon, but I represent it with a double haraka. طيب, so now that we know what we're talking about, now that we know the Shaykh is talking about noon, sakin, and tanween, let's look at what these 4 rules are. Naam, like the word jannatan, مثلا. If we stopped on the word jannatan, we would say jannah, right? طيب. So the Shaykh now starts verse number 7 of the poem. فالأول الإظهار قبل أحرفي للحلق 6 رتبت فالتعريفي. The Shaykh says the first one, فالأول, the first rule we're going to talk about is al-izhar. This is the rule number 1 for noon and tanween. Izhar, we'll talk about what it means just now. He says it applies to qabla ahrufi, and this is the rule for all tanween and noon rules. We always look at the noon, right, and then the letter that comes after it, right? So here is the letter, and then noon is going to be before it. We don't care about what comes before the noon. We only look at what comes after the noon. That's what's going to determine what happens to it, right? So if the noon appears before qabla ahrufi lil halqi, letters that belong to the throat, letters that come out of the throat. Sittin ruttibat fal ta'rifi. There are 6 letters, sittin, that belong to the throat, right? And he's going to organize them. Ruttibat fal ta'rifi. I have organized them, so now we're going to talk about them. He's going to show them to you. So what are these 6 letters that if they appear after the noon, we will have idhar, he says, verse number 8. Hamzun faha'un thumma aynun ha'u muhmalatani thumma ghaynun kha'u. The first letter is, in the order of where they are in the throat, is hamza, u, e, right? Hamzun, faha'un, then ha, then aynun ha'u, ayn and ha. So first 2, hamza ha, then ayn ha. Muhmalatan. Muhmalatan means the ayn and the ha, they don't have dots on top of them, like their cousins that are coming. ثم غين خاء. And then the last two, غين and خاء. So the 6 letters, همز فهاء, ثم عين حاء, ثم غين خاء. Right? Those are our 6 letters that come from the throat that will have idhar applied to them, or will be the cause of idhar. So what does idhar mean? Idhar means to pronounce something clearly, to make something clear. And what this means is that there is no additional ghunna added to the letter noon, right? And the reason we say that is because these 6 letters, hamza, ha, ayn, ha, ghayn, kha, are so far away from the noon, there is no reason to add extra nasalization. I have a question in the chat. What is muhmalatan? Muhmalatan means they do not have dots on them. We say in Arabic, if a letter is mu'jam, mathalan, or mu'jama, it has a dot on it, like ta or dha or dad, mathalan. These are mu'jama. But if I have a letter that doesn't have a dot, like ayn and ha and sad and ta, these don't have dots on top of them. So when he says ثُمَّ عَيْنٌ حَاءُ مُهْمَلَتان, he means the ayn and ha don't have dots on top of them, to differentiate them from the ghayn and the kha, which do have dots on top of them. Now, so because these 6 letters, hamza, ha, ayn, ha, ghayn, kha, they are so far away from the noon, there's no reason to add anything extra to these letters. And there's never an instance where this is not the case, at least for our qira'ah. Hafs, outside of Hafs, we have different rules. So here we have a diagram. At the very bottom of the throat, we have hamza and ha. In the middle of the throat, we have ayn and ha. And at the very top of the throat, we have ghayn and kha. Ghayn and kha, right? And these are the way they're ordered in the throat. Bottom, middle, top. And the noon comes all the way from the front of the mouth here, right? So you can see how far away there is. There's no connection between them. So there's no reason for me to add any extra sound, right? I can just pronounce the noon clearly. So let's look at some examples for all 6 letters with tanween and with noon. So we say man aman. I don't say man aman. La hada khata. This is wrong because the hamza is far away. There's no reason to add extra ghunna. Just say the noon clearly. Man aman. Kaffarin athim. Don't say kaffarin athim. That's incorrect, right? Pronounce the tanween clearly. Min had, qawmin had, sirat alladhina an'amta. See, they're in one word together. Noon with sukoon, and after it is ayn, one of the throat letters. Don't say sirat alladhina an'amta. Khata, right? Sami'un alim. Then the other letters, wanhar, alimun hakim, فسينغضون ماء غدقا من خير كرة خاسرة. Right, in all these cases, I'm just pronouncing the noon or the tanween clearly and not adding or stretching the noon sound beyond its natural 1 haraka length. طيب, so that concludes the verse about ilhar. Let's move on to rule number 2. The Shaykh says, قال الشيخ رحمه الله, والثاني إدغام بستة آتت في يرمولون عندهم قد ثبتت. So verse number 9, he says, the second rule for noon and tanween is called idgham. And it also has 6 letters. Bisitta, idhar has 6 letters, idgham has 6 letters. And these letters are combined in the expression yarmuluna. Fi yarmuluna. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yarmuluna. These letters are the letters of idgham. عندهم يعني عند العلماء وعند القراء قد ثبتت. يعني the rule of idgham is confirmed for these 6 letters in the word yarmulun. What does the word idgham in Arabic mean? Idgham literally means in Arabic to put something inside of something else. Idkhal al-shay fi shay. It means to merge something into something else. In the case of tajweed, it means we're merging one letter into the next letter. And the reason why we do that is because the letters yarmuluna, ya, ra, mim, lam, waw, and noon, they come from makharij, from points of articulation very close to the noon, right? If we take makharij in the future, we'll see they come from places that are very close to the noon. And in the case of the noon itself, it comes from the same makhraj, it's the same letter being repeated, right? And that makes it difficult to pronounce the noon clearly, right? It's difficult for me to say man ya'mal or min wal, because the waw and the ya, they're close to the noon, right? So it's easier for me to take the noon and merge it into the next letter. That's what the purpose of idgham is, to facilitate having letters that are close together. I'm pronouncing letters that are close together, I merge them. But after the Shaykh talks about idgham, he mentions that there's two parts to it. So in the next verse, he says, in verse number 10, لَكِنَّهَا قِسْمَانِ قِسْمٌ يُدْغَامًا. He says, but the idgham, لَكِنَّهَا, is قِسْمَان, two parts. There's two types of idgham. قِسْمٌ يُدْغَامًا فِيهِ بِغُنَّةٍ بِيَنْمُو عُلِمًا. The first part of idgham is idgham that is done with ghunna, idgham bi ghunna, and that applies to the letters yanmu, ya, noon, mim, and waw. So we take yarmulun and we take out ya, noon, mim, and waw. These are the letters that I do idgham with ghunna for. And then in verse 11, he mentions something very important where he says, إِلَّا إِذَا كَانَ بِكِلْمَةٍ فَلَا, except if the noon and one of these four letters, or the six letters even, are in the same word. فَلَا تُدْغِمْ, don't do idgham. Yani idgham only applies when the noon is in one word, or the noon is in one word, and the next letter after it is in a separate word after it, right? In the word immediately after it. So he says, فَلَا تُدْغِمْ كَدُنْيَا. So he gives you the example of the word dunya. Even though I have noon with sukoon and there's a ya, I'm not going to do idgham there. ثُمَّ صِنْوَانٍ, noon and waw, but there's no idgham because they're in one word, right? Idgham only applies to two separate words. ثُمَّ صِنْوَانٍ تَلَا, it has followed as well. Naam. So the Shaykh says, إِلَّا إِذَا كَانَ بِكِلْمَةٍ فَلَا تُدْغِمْ كَدُنْيَا ثُمَّ صِنْوَانٍ تَلَا, except if the noon and the letter after it are in the same word for idgham. So if one of these four letters and the noon are in the same word, don't do idgham, right? So he gives you the example of dunya. Here the noon has sukoon and there's ya. So that means you're supposed to do idgham, but they're in one word. So don't do idgham here. Fala tudghim. Same thing here, sinwan. Don't do idgham here. Now. So the first type he talked about is idgham bi ghunna, which means to merge into the next letter with nasalization. Add the ghunna sound when you're doing merging. And again, it's because the letters yanmu, ya, noon, mim, and waw come from makharij that are very close to the noon, and this makes it difficult to pronounce the noon clearly. So we merge it, but we also maintain the n sound of the noon, right? And again, this only occurs when the letters are in the word following the noon, not when they are in the same word. So here are some examples. Sinatun wala naum becomes sinatun wala naum. Shay'in wakil becomes shay'in wakil. I take the e or the n sound and I merge it with the wa sound. Shay'in wakil. Wujuhun yawma idhin khayran yarah. Right? And I stretch this for two haraka, right? I give the ghunna a length of two haraka. An example of noon being merged into noon. If I have the word walan nushrika, it becomes walan nushrik. I create one noon with shadda. Same thing if I have the word min and mal, it becomes mimmal. I take the noon and I merge it into the mim. Again with tanween, shay'in nukur, khayrun min. I don't say khayrun min. I take the n sound, I merge it into the m. Khayrun min. Now. And then here are the 4 exceptions that appear in the Quran where I have noon in the same word as the letter that's supposed to be merged into it, or it merged into. Qinwan, Sinwan, Ad-Dunya, and Bunyan, right? These 4 words, even though they have a letter of idgham coming after the noon, idgham does not apply because they are together in one word. And if I was to merge them, it would make the word appear incorrect. If I say Qiwan, it might confuse the reader. Or I say Siwan or Buyan or Duya, I do idgham. And there's some kind of confusion there. I'm doubling the letter, even though there's not supposed to be any double letter in this word. And then the Shaykh talks about the second type of idgham. So he says, وَالثَّانِي إِدْغَامٌ بِغَيْرِ غُنَّةٍ. Verse number 12. The second type of idgham is idgham with no ghunna. فِي اللَّامِ وَالرَّاءِ. Idgham with no ghunna applies to lam and ra, right? ثُمَّ كَرِّرَنَّ. Here he's just mentioning something extra. Yani take the ra when you pronounce it and make sure you do takrir, where you roll the R so you make it clear that the R sound is there. What he means by idgham bi ghayri ghunna is that we take the letter noon and we merge it, and in doing so, it completely disappears. Now, we take the noon and it's like we turned it into a lam or into a ra. Right? There's no sign of it being left whatsoever. And that's because the noon and again, the ra and the lam also come from places that are very close to the noon, and it's almost impossible to say it clearly. So it's much easier for me to just completely erase the noon or convert the noon into a lam or ra and then merge them together as one letter with shadda. And when we do that, there's no trace of the noon remaining. So here are some examples. If I have the word min ladunhu, or if I have the word fitnatan lahum, right? What happens when the noon meets the lam, it gets merged into it and it disappears. So min ladunhu becomes mil ladunhu, mil ladunhu. Fitnatan lahum becomes fitnatal lahum. Right, this tanween became a lam, right, with shadda, because I converted it into a lam, then I merge it into the next letter. The word min rabbika, the word min rabbika becomes mir rabbik, right? I don't say mir rabbik with an N sound, it's completely gone. Mir rabbik. Ghafurun rahim becomes ghafurur rahim. Ghafurur Rahim, right? There's no Ghafurur Rahim. The noon is completely gone. It gets merged into the ra. Now we go on to rule number 3 in verse number 13, where the Shaykh says, وَالثَّالِثُ الْإِقْلَابُ عِنْدَ الْبَاءِ مِيمًا بِغُنَّةٍ مَعَ الْإِخْفَاءِ. He says the third rule for noon and tanween is called iqlab, and it only applies to one letter, which is al-ba. So whenever the noon or tanween meets the ba, it gets converted into a meme. I turn the noon into a meme, then I'm going to recite it with ghunna, or I'm going to recite it with ikhfa, which has ghunna in it. So the word iqlab, or some scholars say it's better, it's more afsah, it's more correct to call it al-qalbu, not iqlab. Al-qalbu means to turn something over, to turn something from its top to its bottom or from its front to its back. And what that means is we're taking the noon and we're flipping it into a meme. And then once I turn the noon into a meme, I'm going to do what's called ikhfa shafawi. My lips are going to close and they're going to vibrate. It's going to make a sound, right? This is called ikhfa shafawi. So here are some examples. If I have the word min ba'di, noon has with sukoon met the ba, so I put meme on top of I convert the noon into a meme. So it becomes min ba'di. An burika becomes an burika. أنبئهم becomes أنبئهم, right? In all these cases, it's difficult to pronounce the noon clearly. I can't say أنبئهم, that's hard. It's easier to say أنبئهم, convert the noon into meme and then do ghunna with ikhfa on that meme once it turns into it. The same thing applies for tanween as well. So if I have sami'un basir, it becomes sami'un basir. Jaza'an bima becomes jaza'an bima. Shay'in basir becomes shay'in basir, right? And again, this ikhfa, this ghunna that's happening also lasts for 2 harakat in length. Now we come to the final rule for Noon and Tanween, verse number 14. He says, وَالرَّابِعُ, the fourth rule is الْإِخْفَاءُ عِنْدَ الْفَاضِلِ مِنَ الْحُرُوفِ. Ikhfa applies to the remaining letters. So 6 of them went to idhar, 6 of the letters went to idgham, 1 of the letters went to iqlab, and the remaining 15 letters, he says, عند الفاضل واجب للفاضل, يعني it's wajib to do ikhfa for you, أيها الفاضل, أيها special person, في 5 من بعد 10, يعني in 15 letters, 5 after 10. رمزها في كلم هذا البيت قد ضمنتها, يعني he's going to give you a symbol, he's going to give you an expression with the next verse. The beginning of each word in the next verse is the letter or is a letter of ikhfa. So now he says the famous line, verse 16, صف ذا ثنا كم جاد شخص قد سما دم طيبا زد في توقا ضع ظالما. He says here, صف ذا ثنا, describe a person who is praiseworthy. صاد ذال ثا كم جاد شخص قد سما, how generous is a person who has elevated, how generous they are. كاف جيم شين قاف سين دم طيبا, stay good. دال طاء زد في تقن زاي and فاء and تاء ضع ظالما, put down the oppressor. ضع ضاد and ضاء for ظالما. So these are 15 letters together in this bait, in this line of poetry. You memorize them. You can, if you memorize this line, you memorize all 15 letters of ikhfa. But what does the word ikhfa mean? The word ikhfa means to hide the noon, right? It means the tongue will get very close to the makhraj of the noon, but it does not touch it. And if you're an English speaker, the way you can understand this is say the English word in, like I-double-N, in, and pause on the last letter and feel where your tongue goes. So say in. Now say it again, but don't let your tongue touch the top of your mouth. Don't let it touch your top palate. How does it come out? In. That's ikhfa, right? I'm bringing the tongue very close to the noon, but it doesn't touch the true place of the noon. And the reason is because the letters, the 15 letters of ikhfa, are neither so far away from the noon that I can do idhar with them, but they're also not so close to the noon that I have to do idgham with them. Right? So we say ikhfa is a type of ghunna, is a type of nasalization that is performed, and it occupies a space between idhar and idgham. It's not clear like idhar, but it's not being merged like idgham. So we'll go through one example for each of these quickly, inshallah. So here, we'll just take one example. Now, this is also called al-ikhfa al-haqiqi, right? That's another name for it, al-ikhfa al-haqiqi, differentiated from other types of ikhfa. So we'll take one example each. Mansura, don't say mansura, mansura, tundirhum, wal-untha, minkum, right? That's sad, dhal, tha, kaf, sif, dha, thana, kam, and then أن جاءه من شيء من قبل. Al-insan, right? We hold this ghunna for 2 haraka. That's for Jim, Sheen, Qaf, and Sin. Min duni, an tabaq, al-munzilun. Remember, it can appear in 1 word or in 2 words. Anfusikum. And then the last 3 letters of the 15. Min tafawut, mandud, unzur. Right? All cases, I'm not touching my tongue to the top of my palate. I'm hiding the true makhraj of the noon and doing a slight bit of ghunna along with it. Naam, inshallah. We will touch on that a bit later, inshallah. But there is also a difference between true ghunna is where my tongue is touching the top of my mouth. I'm touching the true part of the where the noon is supposed to be. So remember, like I said, say the English word in, and when you pause on the last letter, you feel your tongue touch the top of your mouth. That's heavy. That's real ghunna. But if I don't let my tongue touch the top of my mouth and I say in, right, this is ikhfa, right? This is what ikhfa is. طيب. So that concludes the 4 rules of noon and tanween. Number 1, idhar, 6 letters. Number 2, idgham, 6 letters. Number 3, iqlab or qalb, 1 letter, which is ba. And then finally, ikhfa for the remaining 15 letters. So we'll just quickly recite the lines for this bab, where he says, للنون إن تسكن وللتنوين 4 أحكام فخذ تبييني فالأول الإظهار قبل أحرف للحلق 6 رتبت فالتعريف همز فهاء ثم عين حاء مهملتان ثم غين خاء. Right, so that's إظهار and the 6 letters. والثاني إدغام ب6 آتت في يرمولون عندهم قد ثبتت 6 letters of إدغام لكنها قسمان قسم يدغما فيه بغنة بينمو لما. But it's 2 parts. One of them is إدغام with غنة for ينمو إلا إذا كان بكلمة فلا تدغم كدنيا ثم صنوان تلا. Except if they're in 1 word together, then don't do idgham. Say the noon clearly. والثاني إدغام بغير غنة في اللام والراء ثم كررن. The second rule is idgham without, or the second type of idgham is idgham without غنة, and that applies to lam and ra. والثالث الإقلاب عند الباء ميما بغنة مع الإخفاء. The third rule is إقلاب, where you turn it into a meme if it meets ba and then do غنة. والرابع الإخفاء عند الفاضل من الحروف واجب للفاضل. The fourth rule is إخفاء for the remaining 15 letters. في 5 من بعد 10 رمزها في كلمي هذا البيت قد ضمنتها. He organizes these letters in this verse. صف ذا ثنا كم جاد شخص قد سما دم طيبا زد في توقا ضع ظالما. Inshallah, we'll take questions at the end. We'll finish in about 10 minutes, inshallah. So the next verse he talks about is the rule for noon and meme with shadda. And here he says in verse number 17, وَغُنَّ مِيمًا ثُمَّ نُونًا شُدِّدًا. Recite the meme and the noon with ghunna if they have shadda. And wherever in the Quran you have meme and noon with shadda, always read them with the highest level of ghunna. وَسَمِّ كُلًّا حَرْفَ غُنَّةٍ بَادًا. And call both of these letters, meme and noon, the letters of ghunna. In Arabic, we refer to mim and noon as the letters of ghunna. Yani the only two letters in Arabic that have a ghunna intrinsic in them all the time is mim and noon. You can tell this because if you plug your nose, you hold your nose, you cannot pronounce N and M, right? Because it requires air flowing through your nose to pronounce them. So for example, here we have وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ سَلَّمَ. Pronounce the noon with shadda, with ghunna. وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ. Same thing with mim. فِي الْيَمِّ وَلَا تَخَافِي. Right? Pronounce it with ghunna. Hold the ghunna for two haraka. Then the Shaykh goes on to talk about the three rules of mim sakina. So we finished noon sakina and tanween, that had 4 rules. Now we're going on to mim sakina, which just has 1 rule less, 3 rules. So he says in verse 18, وَالْمِيمُ إِن تَسْكُنْ تَجِي قَبْلَ الْهِجَاءِ لَا آلِفٍ لَيِّنَةٍ لِذِي الْحِجَاءِ. If mim has sukoon, you're going to find it in the Quran appearing once at least after every letter in the alphabet, except for alif maddiya, alif layyina, because alif cannot have mim sukoon before it. It's impossible. Alif has to have fatha before it all the time. Dhil Hijjar, for those who have yani knowledge and wisdom. He says, أحكامها ثلاثة لمن ضابط. The rules of mim are 3. For those who have yani certified or have affirmed that. إخفاء, number 1. إدغام, number 2. وإظهار فقط, and إظهار, right? So the one we're missing from here, yani technically would be called iqlab, like in noon, because there's nothing that we turn over with noon for mim. So we just have 3 rules: ikhfa, idgham, and idhar. So the first rule he says, فَالْأَوَّلُ الْإِخْفَاءُ عِنْدَ الْبَاءِ. The first rule for mim is ikhfa when it meets ba. وَسَمِّيهِ الشَّفْوِيَّ لِلْقُرَّاءِ. And call this ikhfa, ikhfa shafawi. And that's what we call the noon one ikhfa haqiqi, to differentiate it. So the reason why we do ikhfa is because the letter of ba comes from the same makhraj, the same point of articulation as the mim. So it's almost impossible to pronounce the mim clearly. So instead, I add extra ghunna to the mim, ikhfa shafawi. I elongate the M sound with a ghunna to make it easier to pronounce. So if I have, for example, فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ becomes فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ. وَكَلْبُهُمْ بَاسِطٌ becomes وَكَلْبُهُمْ بَاسِطٌ. يَوْمَ هُمْ بَارِزُونَ becomes يَوْمَ هُمْ بَارِزُونَ. I put my lips together and I drive air through my nose to create this ikhfa shafawi. تَرْمِيهِمْ بِحِجَارَةٍ. And again, this lasts for 2 haraka. Then the Shaykh goes on to talk about the second rule for mim as-sakina, which is وَالثَّانِي إِدْغَامٌ بِمِثْلِهَا أَتَى. So he says mim also has idgham, but only when it meets the same letter as itself. Yani it meets another mim. وَسَمِّ إِدْغَامًا صَغِيرًا يَا فَتَى. And this type of idgham, where I have 2 of the same letter meeting with sukoon on the first letter, is called idgham saghir. And later on in the poem, we're going to take the other type of idgham, which is al-idgham al-kabir and mutlaq, inshallah, when we get to those verses. So idgham al-mutamathilayn al-saghir, yani bimithliha ta, wasam idghaman saghiran, yani we're merging identical letters. So I have a mim with sukoon meeting another mim, can have fatha, dhamma, or kasra, or any of these haraka. It becomes one mim with shadda, right? And the word saghir refers to the fact that the first letter already has sukoon, so little work has to be done when I'm merging them together. I put them together, then I elongate the M sound with ghunna. So if I have the example of وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ, it becomes وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ. أَطْعَمَهُمْ مِنْ جُوعٍ becomes أَطْعَمَهُمْ مِنْ جُوعٍ. وَلَكُمْ مَا كَسَبْتُمْ وآمنهم من خوف, right? We put them together as one letter, both memes with shad, as a meme with shadda, we read with idgham. And sometimes this is also called al-idgham al-shafawi. And then the final rule for meme sakina, the Shaykh says, وَالثَّالِثُ الْإِظْهَارُ فِي الْبَاقِيَّةِ. So ba is for ikhfa, meme is for idgham, and then all the remaining letters, we just do idhar with them, right? Min ahrufin وَسَمِّيهَا شَفْوِيَّةِ. Call this idhar shafawi, differentiate from idhar with noon. And then the Shaykh mentions an important point to watch out for, where he says, وَاحْذَرْ لَدَى وَاوٍ وَفَاءً تَخْتَفِي. Beware of doing ikhfa when the meme meets a waw or a fa. وَاحْذَرْ لَدَى وَاوٍ وَفَاء. Beware of doing ikhfa here. Why? لِقُرْبِهَا وَلِاتِّحَادِ فَعْرِفِي. Because the meme is very close, or the waw and the fa are very close. The waw comes from the same makhraj, walittihadi, comes from the same place as the meme comes from the lips. Qurbiha, because the fa is very close as well. If I say f and they're both using the lips. So a person might mistakenly do ikhfa there, but there's no ikhfa, there's only idhar. And again, idhar shafwi means to pronounce clearly. Every one of the remaining letters that are not ba and meme originate from places that are far away from the meme, and as such, I can pronounce the meme clearly without any need for additional nasalization, any additional ghunna. And again, beware of mistakenly doing ikhfa shafawi with waw and fa. So we'll just look at some examples when are from the Quran. If I have the word hum fiha, pronounce the meme clearly. Don't say hum fiha, that's khata, wrong, right? Pronounce the meme clearly. Lam tunzirhum la yu'minun, right? I'm pronouncing all these memes clearly because there's nothing after them that requires any ikhfa or any ghunna. And again, here are the examples to watch out for. أيديهم وما خلفهم ولا يحيطون. Don't say أيديهم وما خلفهم ولا. هذا خطأ, incorrect. Pronounce the meme clearly. And again, هم فيها. And this is the more difficult one because it's very easy to confuse it with ba because they're very close. To say هم فيها, لا, pronounce the meme clearly. So here's the summary of the three ahkam of meme. Ikhfa shafawi only applies to ba. I just say, like if I have the word يخشون ربهم بالغيب becomes يخشون ربهم بالغيب, right? The second rule is al-idgham as-saghir or idgham al-mutamathilayn as-saghir, merging the same letter together. Naam, inshallah, we'll repeat verse 23 just now. So if I have وَأَسْقَيْنَاكُمْ مَاءً, I merge the two memes together. بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهِمْ مِنْ كُلِّ, right? Merge the memes together into one with shadda. And then all the remaining letters that are not ba and meme, I pronounce the meme clearly all the time. So the Shaykh says, وَالْمِيمُ إِن تَسْكُنْ, the meme, if it has sukun, تَجِي قَبْلَ الْهِجَاء, will appear after every letter in the alphabet, at least once in the Quran. لَا أَلِفٍ لَيِّنَةٍ لِذِي الْحِجَاء, except for alif, because alif cannot have a second letter before it. أَحْكَامُهَا ثَلَاثَةٌ لِمَنْ ضَبَطْ. The rules of meme with sukun are three. إخفاء إدغام وإظهار فقط. إخفاء إدغام and إظهار. إخفاء is 1, إدغام is 2, إظهار is 3. فالأول, the first rule is الإخفاء عند الباء وسميه الشفوي للقراء. Do إخفاء when the meme meets a ba and call it إخفاء شفوي. والثاني إدغام بمثلها أتى. And if the meme meets another meme مثلها, do إدغام وسمي إدغاما صغيرا يا فتى, and call this type of إدغام إدغام صغير, oh my boy. والثالث, the third rule, الإظهار في البقية. The third rule is doing إظهار in all the remaining letters. من أحرف وسمها شفوية. Call this إظهار شفوي. And then the Shaykh gives you a warning when he says واحذر لدى واو وفاء أن تختفي. Beware of doing إخفاء when the meme meets a waw and a fa. Because إخفاء only applies to ba, it doesn't apply to waw and fa. Naam, that's what it means. And he says, why should you beware of waw and fa? لِقُرْبِهَا وَلِاتِّحَادِ فَعَرِفِي. Because waw and fa are close to meme. قُرْبِهَا is referring to the waw because it's close, and ittihadi, meaning the same, they're coinciding together, they're coming together, is referring to waw because it comes from the same place as the meme, right? So he's saying beware of doing ikhfa on these letters, right? Only do ikhfa for ba. طيب, inshallah. So that brings us to the last section for this week, inshallah, this Saturday, inshallah. We have finished at verse 23, bihamdillahi. Next week, inshallah, we're going to cover up to the end of ahkam of idgham al-mutamathilain wal-mutaqaribain wal-mutajanisain, inshallah. So we finished 6 to 16, 17, and 18 to 23. Next week, we'll do 4 and 5, rules of lam sakina and the rules of idgham for similar letters. And then in the final 2 weeks, we're going to break med into 2 classes, inshallah. And finish by the end of Ramadan, بإذن الله عز وجل.